Okay. And Olivia, your team recently published a study called Employee Engagement in the Communications Industry. Why study the comms and PR industry specifically rather than just the broader workforce?
Right. Great question. So, existing research has looked extensively at employee engagement just across industries, but we thought it was especially crucial to look at public relations and communication on its own due to the unique work environment that we all operate in, right? So, we're
Hmm.
facing really tight deadlines, relatively high stress levels, um, often balancing several projects or client accounts at once, all the different stakeholders that have different needs. So, we thought that, of course, it was worth looking into this as we exist in such a unique sort of workplace environment. And we didn't know of another study that took a deep dive into this topic for our industry. So we just thought that it was very important to look into it.
I always read actually on the most stressful professions in the world, and PR ranks pretty high.
Mm.
Yeah. So,
Like surgeons, police, firefighters, right? All I think of stress, but you're right. PR is right up there.
Yeah,
yeah.
and considering we're ranking up there with police and surgeons and firefighters, I think we should be taken a bit more seriously,
Yeah.
right?
Agreed. Agreed.
Saving lives, one press release at a time.
Yes.
Now, Olivia, the study, which thank you so much for sharing with us, and we're going to share a link for our audience, our listeners. The study shows that 89% of communicators report being engaged, much higher than general industry averages. I found that quite surprising, and I was, and also very positive, I'd say. Now, what's unique about communicators and PR professionals that makes them more engaged than other workers in other industries?
Right. So, one key driver of engagement that came out of the data was meaningful work. And the reason that I'm prefacing this with that is because I think that communicators are unique in that we are more highly aware of our organization's mission, vision, values, goals for the future. We're very keyed into that. In fact, we're co creating that in a lot of instances, right? So I think that inherently allows communicators to see more meaning in their work. They see how their work is tied to that greater mission of the organization. So, given that that's a key driver of engagement, I mean, it speaks for itself.
I don't know if the C-suite sees that we're so connected to it sometimes, but yeah. Yeah.
And I've actually never thought about it because we're the ones really thinking about values and mission
Yes.
and purpose and alignment of of our comms according to that lens. And actually, it does bring us closer, and that repeat and reinforcement of knowing actually what the corporate mission is. That's really interesting.
Yes, yes.
So you got high engagement levels. You also found signs of strain, burnout, resource shortages, dissatisfaction, career advancement not going the way you want. Of the issues you covered, burnout, resource shortages, career stagnation, which poses the biggest risk to keeping us engaged over time?
That's a great question. So it's hard to say, but I would predict career stagnation because professional development stood out as one of our primary drivers of engagement in this study. So, of course, burnout and resource shortages are going to be huge challenges for us to address, but those factors didn't seem quite as pervasive as the relationship between engagement and professional development.
I think you could have a system where you have PD points for listening to a podcast. I might have a recommendation.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I wanted to know about flexibility because obviously, ever since COVID, a lot of organizations have gone into remote working, and a lot of organizations, I'm not sure in the US, but in the UK, has just pulled back the remote working, and they want everyone to come back into the office, and flexibility has always been a major factor, especially for those who have dependents, children, elderly parents. In my case, needy dogs, who need me around. I've got a very needy cockapoo who guilt trips me every time I leave the house. Now, it's a major factor. So, did you sort of like come across that as a major issue in terms of schedule flexibility, location flexibility, and is it window dressing now? I mean, what did you see come through in terms of the sentiment of communicators when it comes to the organization and flexibility?
Right. So overall, surprisingly, communicators did seem very satisfied with their workplace location, and a majority were actually working either hybrid or fully remote in our sample. So that doesn't mean everyone everywhere, but within this study sample, we did have a majority who were working in some sort of either hybrid or remote environment. Um, I will say, in terms of it being window dressing, that likely depends on the organization.
Hmm.
So, some organizations, I believe, have truly embraced this idea of flexibility, and it is part of their sort of ethos as a company. And they're really doing well at keeping those flexibility commitments to workers that might have started during COVID times or shortly thereafter.
That's going to place a bit of strain on communicators too, right? Because especially internal, you got some folks that are hybrid, some folks working virtual, and some that get the water cooler stuff. And, and I get to see Farzana's facial expressions when I bring up, something I saw on Netflix last night. Our job as internal communications pros is to weave a fabric that makes for a cohesive narrative in all of that, right? So that we stay engaged.
hmm So I think it might actually be more challenging in hybrid environments for that reason. When you're fully in office, you have everyone right there all the time, right? So that can just,
Sorta.
yeah.
Yeah.
But, you know, so you're not dealing with, oh, so and so is here, and maybe we're not all on the same schedule and that sort of thing. Whereas a fully remote workforce, on the other hand, you could plan sort of engagement strategies knowing that everybody is going to be connecting virtually, or you could plan maybe meetings in person to do some peer connection. And I know we do strategy meetings. We're a fully remote team, so I do think that some organizations have it down and they're still committed to it. Others, not so much. We're seeing a lot of return to office mandates right now. We're saying you're going to be in the office 5 times a week. If you don't like it, leave. So there are definitely some companies that have not quite stuck to their guns when it comes to flexibility. And I'm really interested to see how that does impact their employee engagement and retention as we move forward.
Did you see any patterns in your data? Because you obviously had people who are remote, hybrid, as well as full time in the office. Did you see any varying levels of engagement? Were sort of yeah, between people who are working hybrid or in person or fully remote.
We were expecting to see large differences, and we statistically did not see those differences. So it was really interesting.
Really?
Yes, really. We also studied whether or not you mentioned earlier, Farzana, about how you are a caretaker to your dog child.
Yeah.
And a lot of people are now, and we looked at differences between caregivers, their engagement at work, how their work situation was, and we didn't find a difference with caregivers either. It wasn't statistically significant, but actually caregivers were slightly more highly engaged than their non-caregiver counterparts. So that was very interesting.
I know
Yeah.
I know there was one area that stood out, the gap between being asked for feedback and seeing action. And oh God, I know I've had this happen where we'll have entire sessions, brainstorming sessions, and then at the end, whoever was facilitating, they're coming to some conclusions that I never heard at all in the room. I didn't hear any of that in the room. There's a gap here between listening and action, that the listening is lip service.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You saw the same in the study.
Yes, we saw that. It was very prevalent in the data.
Mm.
So I have several strategies based on what we found to sort of close this listening action gap that you mentioned. So, first, it's incredibly important for leadership to provide transparency behind their decision making. That was a call that we saw from several respondents across the board. So, organizations should provide context behind big organizational decisions to build employee trust and sort of foster that trustworthy relationship. Um, Another strategy that I have. So, progress toward the organizational commitments and goals should be tracked. Teams and leaders should be held accountable. There should be accountability systems in place where there's some sort of documentation, it's regularly revisited with the whole team, and updates on any progress toward those goals should be shared openly. And also, when, say, for instance, leaders hear suggestions from employees and they cannot follow through on either a commitment that they had made or something that they had said they were going to do earlier, they should quickly acknowledge the fact that they can no longer meet that commitment and explain why. So it's a lot of that sort of give us the background information, let us know the reasoning behind things. And then lastly, one other strategy that I'll share is leaders should make sure to listen to employees at all levels of the organization. We saw a marked difference in the data between more senior leaders feeling like their opinions were valued and heard versus employees at other levels of the organization, like entry level employees, mid level employees. So there should be equal listening across the board. It might take a little bit more effort, of course, on the organization's part to reach out into maybe their broader audience of employees who aren't the most senior, but it's incredibly important to get a holistic view of the organization.
I completely agree. And I've seen some organizations I've worked with over the years that they've actually created a listening task force that is across geographies, across functions, and across sort of seniority as well. And to really, in this listening task force, there's no hierarchy and it's active listening. And I always felt that was really brave of them and also just incredibly wise because often, they really need to understand that it's the diversity of thought across their employees that will give them that real macro perspective, which I think is very good. Just going back to the sort of the listening action gap, do you feel that actually, to do an exercise of active listening in itself has a value because it makes people feel heard? But then that ends up becoming completely eroded if there's no follow-up, because you see a lot of these initiatives like, oh, sentiment is down for employees, let's do a survey, let's do a focus group, let's do a listening exercise, and then it sort of ends up with a little bit of a rise in sort of hope that there's going to be a change or difference, but then afterwards there is, it sort of loses momentum, and that's kind of almost worse than having done it in the first place.
Right. Exactly. I think, of course, that's going to depend on the situation that you're dealing with, but this is where the importance of that tracking toward whatever you said you were going to do comes into play. So at that point, when you're saying, okay, we said yes to this earlier, and then time goes by and it sort of either drops off, no one hears about it ever again, it doesn't actually end up happening. You need to close that feedback loop. Leadership needs to be following up and saying, okay, maybe we're not there yet, but here's what we're doing to move toward that. Or we've decided that that's no longer a goal that we're able to move toward. Here's why, maybe we can revisit this in the future if that's true. But open honesty and transparency, I think, wins in this case, and also that sort of frequency of communication.
When I look back at my parents' generation, they would stay in companies for 10, 20, 30 years. They would be in the office, 5 days a week, and, they'll go to their Christmas parties and all of that. And we are just operating in a different world. So, the tenure tends to be a lot shorter. You've got a lot more people coming in project-based work versus sort of full-time, part-time, remote, hybrid, in-person, and so
Fractional
forth.
leaders, right? Part-time leaders. Yeah.
Yeah. So how can communicators weave this incredibly fragmented group together through the power of communications to really try and ensure that everyone understands the organizational purpose and values? Because you said it's something really interesting that actually as comms people, we're quite engaged because we're constantly thinking about our work day to day. And one of our sort of, lenses is what's the organizational value? Is everything we're doing aligned to it? But other people aren't thinking about that every day because they're not in the comms function. And with the challenges that, they're working part-time, full-time, project-based, a couple of years in and out. How can you create that connective tissue of culture around them, and how can you get them to understand what the values and the culture is when people are sort of looking at their watch saying, well, I'm going to be out of here in about 9 months?
Right. Isn't that the question of the day?
Mm-hmm.
I wish I had an answer that applied across the board because we would have an amazing business idea right here if we did, right? So, it's such a challenge that I think we're all facing right now, just between the changing workforce and all of the external change that's happening that communicators are being expected to navigate, right? And still keep that mission intact and communicate with everyone. Um, I think this goes back to the best answer I have, which isn't a perfect answer, but goes back to that whole notion of giving your employees meaningful work. So maybe they are planning to job hop in the next year or so. And we actually asked in the study, are you planning to move careers in the next year? And I don't remember exactly what the figure was. It wasn't extraordinarily high, but it also wasn't extraordinarily low. So you do have, a little bit of that turnover shown in the data as well. So I would say just allowing them to have some sort of connection to the work, whatever that means for their role. And that might be targeted depending on, is this a contractor? Is this somebody who's not normally working a desk job that's in a manufacturing job and you'll have to find a way to communicate with them that isn't email because they're not on their computers all day like your desk-based workers are. So I guess my answer is meeting employees where they are and finding a way to sort of loop that common thread into their day to day and make work more meaningful for them, whatever that means.
Olivia, thank you so much for your time today, and particularly for that wonderful piece of news that actually us as communicators are one of the most highly engaged workforce. And, definitely you can take this episode and show your boss and as evidence and proof that our
Hmm.
industry, actually, we are very engaged and we should be valued, and to bear that in mind in the next salary review.
You're welcome, everyone.